Thank you, Adriana Kuiper, for having me. I just want to give a special thanks to Mount Allison University, Strutt's Gallery and Fawcett, as well as Amanda Foto. It's really a pleasure for me to be out here all the way across the country, coming from BC. We had a similar kind of winter, but not as cold as here. So I'm really pleased to be here. And also really happy to share this body of work with you. I'm going to start, as Adriana had mentioned, I work through quite a bit of different mediums. So as I go through the work, you'll see that I move between video, animation, installation, something that I maybe call socially engaged or community engaged projects. And I'll explain why that is an important aspect of the work that I make. But most importantly, I engage with the matter of memory and also look at and try to witness and re-remember difficult histories that are connected to my own family sort of personal narrative and archives. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the first image here. We're looking at an image of Japanese men leaving by CNR to the eastern destinations from the Vancouver Public Library. And so for many years, most of my body of work has been interested in the importance of storytelling. And as you see a bit later in the work, I'm very interested in this idea of the creature, inventing fictions, working with fables and myths. But when I started my artistic practice, it was really important for me to flip that camera lens inward and to look at my own personal identity and also how a country has constructed a Japanese-Canadian identity. For those of you that don't know, on the West Coast, Japanese Canadians during World War II were uprooted and interned and sent to prison camps around the interior of BC, including my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, my 4 aunts, and 2 uncles. And so for me, I've been fascinated with this idea of creating images again that no longer exist. So working through the invisible, working through sort of the shadowy past of history and how to artistically and aesthetically and ethically work through those things. During my grad studies, I read a lot of work by Annette Kuhn, Marianne Hirsch, which are feminist memory scholars, and they talk about that relationship where the artist engages in an active participation in remembrance, which also requires forgetting, sometimes making up. Annette Kuhn calls that term memory work. Marianne Hirsch uses a term called post-memory, which is when generations that are removed from historical trauma go back into the past and use things that are readily available, so archival images, films, and then try to create their own aesthetic. So one example from popular culture would be Art Spiegelman's Mouse, where you have the author trying to go through the Holocaust memory, and you see panels of him sort of figuring out sort of the relationship to him and his father, and then the actual unpacking of the history. So some of the works that you'll see that I present, they're very process-based, and I'm always so interested in what happens behind the scenes and how to flip that forward. So we're always, as an artist, I think we're always investigated in what we're going to put into the gallery or how we engage the space. I'm always also interested in the stuff that happens in the back and about moving that forward. So there's a tension there in my work that I hope you'll see. So going back to this idea of storytelling, I was interested in this idea of storytelling as a political act, storytelling as a way of assembling and organizing facts and stories that are not written about so publicly. So I'm engaged with private archives. Oftentimes, I may be sifting through material like going through an archive of images, and may come across an image like this. And when I was starting out doing my master's, I would be going through images, photographs, and most of the photographs from the internment are shot by American photographer Ansel Adams or Leonard Frank, who's a Canadian photographer, and they're just the sort of documenting the truth or what was happening. So you're going to get images like this. And what was startling for me, and I think this is sort of the porous opening, was that when I was in the archive looking at this image, the 3rd panel down is actually my grandfather, so my father's father. And it was this really strange moment of being in a public archive and just bumping up against this ghost, this man that I didn't know, and about approaching history through that way, that he is one of, all these images are like cataloged, like 1994, 1942 or 41, 000, but then having a personal face to the image. So a lot of my work kind of begins there. and moves back and forth between a public archive and then personal stories, anecdotal stories, and memories. This is an image, a family portrait, Slocan City. So this is my entire paternal family, my dad being the boy with the slicked hair to the side. And it's an unknown photographer. One sort of fact that gives context to why I'm fascinated with the invisible is that any kind of media, so cameras, radios, anything that could capture media was actually destroyed in the camp so that you couldn't take photographs there. So it was unusual for someone to have a camera or a photograph. So photographs that come up like this, which was sort of in a chocolate box that my grandmother had stored photographs, is very unusual. And the other interesting thing about memory work is that you never know when these photographs will crop up in time. So it's not like they're all going to happen on the day you're researching. You could be finished a project and then years later another image would come up that sort of shifts the narrative. So it's that kind of tension that I'm working with when I string together these stories and to make sense of the work. This photograph was taken the day after the Japanese Canadians were released from the camps, and the government had given them a so-called choice of either going east of the Rockies or exiled, or what was called repatriated to Japan. And so my family picked repatriation. And so even if they were Canadian citizens, they decided to join my grandfather's family in Japan, which had just lost the war. And lived through other forms of racism there as a racialized subject. I think they were seen as sort of American nationals living in Japan. So when I traverse this train of memory, you'll see later in the work, it moves back and forth between the Trans-Pacific as well, so Japan and Canada. In 2012, I was invited to do a commissioning project that would commemorate the 70th anniversary of the internment camp. And as an artist, receiving something like that is a little bit of a heavy burden. And I'm also very aware of this sort of slippery nature of using those images and what does it mean to repurpose them, use them again. And I'll go back to this idea of the ethics of these the relationship to these images and the new images I produce. But in this year when I was making this work, I went into the archives. It's an archive called the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center, and it's in Burnaby. And it houses quite a large collection of objects and photographs from the internment and also pre-war. And I was fascinated, again, similar to that, the image of my grandfather in the train, these sort of austere, sort of postcard, very nostalgic kind of a BC landscape type imagery or photography. These ones were taken by our CMP officers that had a very topographical view and looked down and were just shooting or documenting the space. I was interested in images like that. These are some more images of the camps that my father and his family were in. So this is Popoff, Slocan. This one is Sandon. And then juxtaposing them with images that seem to crop up in my digging through places like family albums, kind of old childhood spaces, my grandmother's box of empty chocolates that she sort of stored images in, and this sort of out of order time. I was interested in pulling out these more personal images. This image that you're looking at is my grandmother's berry farm that was confiscated during the war as well, and it's the last existing document of a property that belonged to her. And then those properties were taken from them and then sold and used to build the internment camp. So it's a strange kind of cycle of capital there. And so I was drawn to these rare photographs that were personal, or I was applying personal meaning to them, juxtaposed with sort of the more grand, kind of, I guess, more postcard austere images of the internment camp. And so this is a series of videos. Panorama Series 1 pans through, it's almost just like a light scan of these internment images juxtaposed with these smaller stations where I've used light to light up digital reproductions of my grandmother's images, which are quite small, so I've just blown them up to like a 5x7, and then taken a knife and cut out the figures and lifted them up. So there's this idea of tracing out the image, tracing out the figure, and lightly lifting it. So very simple. This photograph, which is a pinhole camera photograph. So somebody there were artists probably in the camps, but somebody wanted to make a pinhole camera and document the day-to-day life. So this was one made by a pinhole camera that I found, that my father had stored away in an album that I hadn't seen. Even if I had been doing this research for so long, I hadn't come across this image and brought them into the mix. So Panorama Series 1, there's a series of spotted images that are smaller, intimate, versus the larger slate with a series of moving camp images. It's also about how we read images, and what floats up to the surface and what is invisible, what is lost. Over on the first plinth, you'll also see that there were other pieces of ephemera in my collection of finding out more about the internment, and some of them came through story. So what you're looking at, it's difficult to see maybe on that glass, is my father had a single memory of the camp, Sandon, which is actually this one. And basically, when they displaced the Japanese Canadians, they took them far out to the forest so that they could never find their way back into the city. And so Sandon actually was in the bowl of BC, in the mountains, so they didn't get daylight often. So I think the sun went down at 3 or 4, and my dad just remembers this roaring river. It's sounds basically like snow. And when I went to the Banff Center to do a residency, I actually was able to go back and visit there. And while I was at Sandon, the thing that kind of popped for me was just the static sound of this river. And so I just happened to catch it on my phone or a device that I had at the time. And little pieces like that are sort of floating in the space. So it's this juxtaposition of the master narrative and the way images are organized in an archive versus the way they actually will appear to somebody who's connected maybe to the history. Also, a lot of people that had gone through this, they were silenced, so they couldn't really speak these stories. So it's always very difficult to draw these stories out. So those are sort of two kind of elements that I'm working with. In 2012, Mikiko Hara, who's a curator at the International Center of Contemporary Art in Vancouver, Center A, organized a group exhibition for, I think it was 6 artists, about the BC Electric Railway Station. So the old gallery used to be in this railway station that had a line that went from New Westminster, British Columbia into town. And she asked 6 artists to respond to the collective memory of Vancouver and this area known as the Downtown East Side, and asked these artists to draw on a site and think about this neighborhood's history and create a work in response to it. And so at that time, I was fascinated with that area just near the gallery called Powell Street, which used to be Japantown before the war. And it was filled with things like markets, restaurants, bathhouses, confectionery shops. And I found that fascinating that there was 19 of these specialty confectionery candy shops. And so this image you're looking at is a portrait of Hatsue Yamake in the Kasuga Kashiten at 359 Powell. And I asked Mikiko, I said, do you think it would be possible if I recreated the site of one of these candy shops as a part of the work in the gallery? And she said, sure, go for it. We can try a work like that. And so what I ended up doing was looking for elders in the community that had some kind of remembrance to Powell Street. They would be people that were probably between the ages of 80 and maybe 90. Most of them have passed away, and I found 5. And I asked them to think back to a time when they were a child and they might have had a suite on Powell Street. And I was interested in this idea that maybe through taste memory, the visual landscape of a place could arise. And so I'm just going to play a little clip of one of the elders. It's playing. No? It's not playing. Okay. You'll have to imagine. You'll have to imagine it. But should I bring up the file or let it? Okay. Okay, I'm just going to go through it anyway. Sorry about that. So the elders will, so I interviewed these elders, and they would speak about a place generated mostly through taste. So it's not going to come up. In this recording, Grace Aiko Thompson, who's an elder in our community, kind of maps through, as a child, the site of Powell Street based on Smarties that she had, or what was essentially Smarties now, these cinnamon candies, these really sweet buns that she had, and sort of a imaginary town would kind of arise. And so I was fascinated with bringing these stories into the gallery space, and then also took the time to learn to make some of these traditional pieces. And so what was staged in the installation is sort of a makeshift confectionery shop. It's a traditional Japanese staircase, and you get to hear these 5 audio recordings by these elders talking about taste memory. And then I went so far as to work with a group of Japanese Canadian elders and had them teach how to make these traditional sweets. And they were very protective of their knowledge, right? So they were just like, who are you? What are you doing here? Why do you want to use this project? Or why do you want to use our recipe for this project? And so it takes, and I'm, to do this kind of work, to work with elders, to work with the stories of other people in the community, it takes a whole kind of working of trust and work in the community, which it's hard to document or show that, but it takes this kind of working and talking through. And when you collect these stories, oftentimes I'm fascinated that they take place in people's homes, in kitchens, and domestic spaces while eating snacks. So I was fascinated with that as well. And so back in the gallery, you have probably 10 to 12 different kinds of tastes that they each remembered. And on the day of the opening, sort of a candy striper would stand there and hand out the candy. You could buy them and try them, and then sit and be in a space of listening to these stories and taking this all in. That's it. That's our team photo. Shortly after this, I think a few months after this exhibition, because you spend time in the archive, because you spend time working through really difficult histories, as an artist, I think it's important to also, question that relationship to that. Why are you fascinated with these images, and to push your own aesthetics forward. And so I was curious about thinking about archives in a way that was more repository, so not about collecting things, but about breaking things up, pulling things out. And so I started to do a different kind of body of work. So this will take a bit of a departure. What you're looking at is my studio wall and some notes. This work that I'm going to go into now is called Morko, which is the Finnish word for monster. And I was working with sound artist Emma Hendricks, and Jamie Long from Theatre Replacement, which is the theatre company in Vancouver. And I was fascinated with this idea of the monster. So this work is based on a collection of interviews from Vancouver residents around what they identified as a monster or a creature. And through this performance, I was also fascinated with this idea of the object. So no longer an object that carried the weight of history, no longer an object from the archives, but another kind of object. I'm always fascinated with this idea also of puzzles, and so the artistic team was interested in looking at different objects that kind of reflected fear for me. So when Jamie Long, my collaborator, kind of turned it on me and said, if you're going to collect stories around monsters from other people, what are you afraid of? As I sort of thought back to my childhood past and remembered in our childhood home, we had this strange room called the choo-choo room. So in Japanese, mice would say choo-choo, choo-choo. And my mom would be like, if you are bad, you're going to go in the choo-choo room. And the choo-choo room was also very fascinating for me because my father shot film, Super 8 and 35 mil in there, processed photographs. Then it became like a place where we stored old furniture. And then recently, in like 2012, my mom decided to store everything from my childhood in there. So Jamie was like, go back to the choo-choo room and open it. Have you opened it? I was like, I haven't opened it. It's like, you go and open it. So I opened it up, and she had things in there like Hot Wheels racetrack cars. She collected every 7-Eleven Slurpee cup and Dixie cup with a caricature on it. I don't know why. Every shoe that I wore from ages 1 to 12, a whole collection of Nancy Drew books, just all these knickknacks, all this stuff. And so the puzzle became that I would create a 45-minute performance based on these objects, so moving them from the archive shelf and onto the table and stacking. As I go with mine. And every evening I would repeat this ritual, and everything was choreographed and set meticulously so that we would create a sort of a table and a universe of objects. There were animations, stop motion animations that sort of intercut between. And the soundtrack that you're listening to is about 45 minutes of people telling their stories around monsters, everybody from the ages of 4 all the way to like 70. And the technique that I use to collect the stories is a sociological technique called snowballing, where, say, if I told you a story, you told me a story, and then you might have said, oh, if you go up the street to the used bookstore, she's got a great story about a monster, and then I would find myself there, and then she would tell me, oh, you go down the street and ask the baker, and he'll tell you a story. So similar to Confections, where I tried to trace back a place that didn't exist, this was another kind of tracing through hearsay, through fiction, through story. And so Morco became this portrait of sound and moving images that portrays a city through the monstrous. I'm also interested when I create theatrical pieces that I lead a very small, intimate group of audiences, so only audiences of 30 were able to experience each of these performances. We worked in a space called the Russian Hall, which is sort of this strange kind of Twin Peaks place where it's sort of odd and has a really weird theater. And instead of having audiences sit where audiences would sit, we actually created the setup on the stage, and so you're led through. You go through this intimate experience, and at the end, the sculpture is built based on every little knickknack that my mom kept, her kind of own archive of things from my childhood. And for me, it was interesting because as I went through each object, as a child, I have a familiarity with the book or, this penguin, and it was sort of this repetition, this idea of tracing and drawing through. Also, at the heart of this piece is a conversation with my mom about what we're going to keep and what we're going to let go. So there's this really funny tension around that. In 2014, I'm just going to traverse now. We're going to leap forward. Still working with the curator, Makiko Hara, she was fascinated with that work, Morco, and she asked me what this work might look like in another city. And she had been doing a project in Yokohama, Japan, which is Vancouver's sister city, and she invited me to come in for an artist residency in a residency called the Kokonecho Bazaar. And she asked me if I could think about a sister piece for Morco. So I, accepted the challenge and went there. For those of you that don't know Yokohama very much, during the post-war had American occupation. It's a very interesting sort of town of like fusion. There's obviously the effects of Americanization there. There's like a jazz community. There's something that's very mishmash. There's something that's not quite Japanese, not quite American when you go there. And this area of Kokonecho, I don't know if people have seen the film by Akira Kurosawa, but he has one film that actually uses this place as the set. But during the post-war, this area was what's called the red light district, or actually blue light district, with sort of like the Japanese yakuza and prostitution and it's sort of like the monster of the post-war. And very recently, in the last 5 years, that gentrification took over, and this artist residency came in, and they were doing things in the city to revitalize the city, and this is one of the residencies that came through that. And so different artists would come there, and these spaces are actually brothels. So they used to be brothel spaces. They used to be these little tea houses. And each of the artists had a space to make stuff. And I wanted to think about this idea of what I could give back, or what I could gift. It's unfortunate we couldn't hear that other audio recording, because in that story the elder talks about the sweet as a gift, so that no Japanese would walk around town without a gift that you could give. So if I was coming to visit Amanda, I would make sure that I had some good brownies or something to gift. So I was interested in this idea of the gift, the object as a gift, versus maybe how I had previously looked at historic images from the camps. And so I offered my studio space as a fortune reading site. So I've been reading fortunes for some time, and I thought, okay, maybe I will open up a fortune shop, and this is the lens to which I will gather monster stories. So I had to collect a series of monster stories from the community of Koganecho. And so we made a sign, we set up the booth, and I thought this was also a great way for me to meet these strangers that I don't know, and because to share an intimate story like the monster story is so personal. So I wanted to give something back. And also my way of sort of looking at I was interested also looking at the future and looking at time in this way. And so we put up posters, we sent out the release, and we got thousands of people coming. Everybody in Japan wanted to get their fortune told, and I was like, oh my goodness. So a huge collection of people were just showing up, and I had to shut the store down. But people were coming in, and they were very eager to leave behind these monster stories in a really different way than I had the experience in Vancouver. And people were showing up, and maybe it was because of this lens that I was offering a fortune, like really fantastical, crazy monster stories, and things about different spirits and different creatures and folklore. And I was very interested in that. And so they would sit in front of me, and we'd have these conversations. There would be a sending and receiving of information and stories. After they left, I so that I wouldn't forget the story, quickly kind of drew together in hand-drying clay a whole series of monsters. So the space became filled with these tiny little statues of monsters. And then I was actually requested, Makiko was like, and try to finish your performance too, do that too. So there was this other leg of trying to do the performance, but I just couldn't. It was very strange, but I came across a funny block. So I was able to sort of workshop the performance, but something wasn't right, which I think happens sometimes in making work. And I workshopped the performance, but something didn't sit right with it. And I think it was just sort of the heavy burden of a whole city. Like I was able to feel all these things that they feared, and all these creatures, and I didn't know what to do with it ethically and aesthetically. You'll see later in 2016, I was able to work through the puzzle and create a performance, but at that time, I just couldn't. The other thing that was happening during that residency was Yokohama is actually the hometown of my mom. So I was fascinated, just like in Morco, where I was looking at the choo-choo room as a childhood space that contained stories. I thought, okay, what could be the touchstone in Yokohama that I could turn to? Since I didn't have the objects of my childhood house, like what could I use to construct in this performance? And so I knew of a house in a city called Shin-Sugita, which is where my mom grew up. And what's fascinating about this house, so this is just a sort of a study, a photographic study that I did in my studio, is that my grandfather on my mother's side was a poet and a composer, and they housed everything in the house to the left. And when the recent earthquake came, the locks of the house sealed, and the roof sort of slid in, and so that nobody could actually get back into the house. And so the family just decided to leave it there and move into a house next door that resembled it. So it's sort of like this weird twin house thing happening. And then no one's opened the house. It's just sitting there on the lawn. And so I was fascinated, and I went down there to look at it. And all I could do was walk the perimeter of the house and look in, and everything was sort of preserved at like 1960s or whatever. It was really old, and there was a piano in there. And the sad thing about it is, if you were to kind of break into the house, you'd either lose everything because the roof would fall, or there would just have to be some wild excavation of all the bits of architecture. So I was fascinated with this weird archive house that floated there. And so a work that I also made during residency looked at some of these these pieces, and particularly just the shadows and the silhouettes that I could see, just about the images that crawled up. So when I was there, I had an aunt that lived next door, and she sort of would be like, "You can't go into the house." And she was this mysterious aunt of mine, "But I'll show you this one image of your mom playing piano." It's like only little snippets of stuff were given to me. So in the studio, because it was a brothel, the space just is the space of a single body. So everything is narrow, and there's all these like strange mirrors and things set up. So I worked with this architecture of the space and created what was sort of like just something you can't pass through. And so what we're looking at here is a doorway with several holes. And if you peek in, you're actually staring at a mirror, but there's a photograph of the house up on the left corner, and then a cutout silhouette of my mom playing the piano. And through the installation, you just hear this piano playing, because it was a piano playing mom. So something very haunting. And back here, I just want to go back to these ones. The only thing that I carried with me to Yokohama, just before you leave for residency, sometimes you just grab a bag and pick up stuff. I just intuited to carry a reel of, my dad had shot something on Super 8, and I digitized it and brought it in my laptop. And it was actually the ocean liner, the Hikawa Maru, which is an ocean liner boat that brought Japanese Canadians back to Canada and also shipped them out after the internment. So it's this boat. So when my father went back to Japan in the 1960s with my brother, as a firstborn son, he shot video footage of this ocean liner, and then it was when he passed away, I received this footage and thought, what a weird thing to shoot. And so I carried it with me to the residency, and what was kind of interesting was that beside the residency, you could actually walk to the Hikawa Maru, which is now a museum. So I thought that was interesting. So I used that piece of footage as a map and kind of retraced what he shot and superimposed the two. And so in the installation space, when you walk in, the lower floor is my fortune shop, where I collected these monster stories. And then the upper floor was sort of these findings that I had found. And what you're looking at is a projection using theater scrim that kind of creates this weird triangle shape. So the footage shifts around in a circle. After that very intense residency, I made my way back home and was I was stuck with all this material from the residency, and waited 2 years until I could produce the sister piece of Morco, which is Locke. And Locke means the great hole. Because in some ways during that residency, though I felt it was productive, I had felt like I'd fallen down a hole. I felt like completely lost in my practice and completely stumped. And then felt I was able to return back to it with a different set of eyes. Also, what was happening was my relationship as an artist, as someone who was born in Canada and going back to Japan. There was all these kind of deja vu, strange things happening as well. And so after 2 years, we produced, again, with a collaborative team of contemporary dancers, theater performers. We did a piece called Locke, and I also brought back Emma Hendricks, who's the sound artist, and created a sister piece to Morco. So we restaged Morco again. After you experience that building of those childhood objects, a screen opens up, and you sort of enter into the world of Locke. And so for this one, I created a series of sort of handmade puppets, objects that people could wear. What you're looking at right now is a set piece, which is the old house that I encountered in Koganecho of my mom's childhood house. We brought in an old piano that we found at the Russian Hall, which is where we worked on Morco. And I don't play piano, but for the performance, the puzzle there was for 35 minutes I had to play Beethoven. And so, and I'm not good at it. And so, I worked with a piano player in Vancouver, and she's trying to teach me piano, and I just couldn't get it. And the only thing I could do was I could sketch her fingers. So I sketched the score of a Beethoven, just all by really weird doodles, and then used that as my means of playing. And the piano is connected to a mic that is connected to Emma, who's generating sound. And so there's no text in Locke, it's just sound. And just these really strange and bizarre characters that come out. Sorry, the one that you're looking at here was Oi. And just to give you an idea of the kind of monster story it was, when one person came for a reading, and he very carefully, actually it was the image of the boy that I showed in the fortune shop, and he said, "My monster story is this thing called Oi." And he just has a big, big, big head like the moon. And then every time I'm stressed out and I can't finish my artwork, he hits me on the side of the head and goes, "Oi." And so that's the kind of monster story that would appear. Those are the kind of monster stories I would collect. And they're just really wild. And so, and you can see I didn't know what to do with all this information. And these are 3 little Cupid characters. I should maybe make a little side note that in my research to the childhood house, my aunt who lived beside the house, who's this really great piano player and musician, she lives with this little doll called Hanako. It's this like little Cupid doll, and everybody in the city believes in it, and everybody believes that it's real. And so it's like that was another kind of stumped thing that I had. I was like, there's these dolls next door in my aunt's house, what's happening? And I had called my mom, "Do you know about these dolls?" And she's like, "I know, I didn't want to tell you. I wanted it to be a surprise." Anyways, so there's some doll characters. And now that I'm at the Marshlands Inn, I feel like I should do performance in there with the dolls. I'm just like, it is my calling. And here's another scene. If you go to my site, I didn't bring I'm always afraid of showing media because I always think it's going to crash like it did. But there's a clip of Locke. A scene like this is an interview with somebody who said that their monster was this idea of returning back into the pink womb and walking, and then the womb burst. And so we had to do maybe 16 of these vignettes, all in the style of puppets, and I guess I call this live. It's not animation, they're happening live, but so something like that. I'm playing Beethoven, there's a helium tank connected, and I'm playing Beethoven, I have to lean over and turn the helium tank on so that blows up, and then I carry on and then turn it off. So it was just everything was a puzzle in the piece. It had to be done immaculately. This is the inside of the set with me playing piano with Oi. There were a few just small animation projections, and the animations are used in a way to kind of bring out the fantastical, and for me it's been a great medium to allow myself to play after working through such heavy things, and I still return back to those things, but it's just a way to kind of enable a new possibility, new ways of looking at history as well. So there's some animations in there and more characters. Are we okay for time? Yeah. I will just go through 2 more works. Going back to this doll, sorry, I have to go back to this doll, because I'm going to land on an image and everyone will get confused. So the aunt with the doll was there. I also, at that time, in Yokohama, while I was in residence, studied with a Buto dancer. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with Kazuo Ono, who's passed away now, but he's a renowned Buto dancer, and his son still holds the Kazuo Ono dance studios. And I was so confused and so stuck. I felt I was stuck. Here's monster stories, my aunt with the doll, the house that I cannot get into. And so I took this Buto class, and he's like, "You don't want to learn Buto. After hearing this story, you want to learn how to move dolls." And so he actually spent 4 weeks with me moving dolls. I'll just show an image of that later. And so my relationship to the doll was able to be activated, maybe shifted something in terms of my relationship to objects and how they transmit things. And thinking about this idea of the doll. So the doll will appear again in a moment. I just wanted to say that. And so I've gone back to Japan actually this year to work on a project called the 105 Chrysanthemums. And I was invited to a gallery at the Wakayama Museum in Yokohama, and it's really great if you're interested in manga or illustrations. So Mr. Wakayama was a man that collected all these underground comics, and comics made by women mostly that were banned in the war, or you wouldn't really see them in the war. And so this beautiful collection of these woodblock prints, objects to tell stories with, so kamishibai boxes, and these books, these magazines, and drawings. And they have a small gallery upstairs, and they've been bringing Canadian artists, Glenn Lewis or Hank Bull, and they invited me for 2016 to come in and make a work for that. So I was thinking about this idea of stories by women, and decided to go and try to think of a narrative or think of something. But I was really fascinated with, instead of using objects, making objects. And so I remembered sometime in 2000, just before my grandmother passed away, she spoke very vividly about this dream before she died. And it was a dream of our childhood porch being filled with these chrysanthemums, like the fingers calling her a bright light. And I remember her, she had taken a fall and I was taking care of her, and she was telling me this sort of an intimate story. And I thought, oh God, this maybe is a bad omen. But I just remembered it also because it was such a beautiful dream. And this work kind of reverses something that I've always been doing. I've always been interested in moving objects, working objects, looking at objects, and I thought in this example I would make something. And so 105 chrysanthemums. The other stuff that was happening, I should say, when I was in Japan, a lot of things were nostalgic, things were coming up that were like deja vu, and I was also very hyper aware of the landscape and the gardens. And so I would be walking down alleys and thinking, why do I know these plants are very familiar? This type of arrangement of plant where you take chrysanthemums on a childhood porch in a pot, and I'm like, where have I seen this before? And it's basically my childhood porch and how my father and my grandmother would arrange flowers, which I thought was maybe just a regular thing that they did, but it sort of was rooted in Japanese landscape. And so I was hyper aware of these things from childhood that were kind of waking up while I was in Japan. And so taking this dream, I was interested in this idea of creating a talisman or an object, a lucky object. And so I was researching chrysanthemums which is a very difficult plant if you're a gardener to grow. And so this is like 2 photographs of chrysanthemums and my mom writing, this is a 7-year bud or 7-year stem of chrysanthemum, and there's ones that are 19 years or 11 years. And so they have all these gardens in our childhood home. And I was interested, in replicating this dream through objects. And so I was thinking about lucky talismans, thinking about materials I could use, and thinking about 2 things that come together randomly in the world. And so at the time I was looking at the formation of rocks and the formation of chlorite, which is a crystal that will fuse itself to quartz and then produce these things called phantom stones. This sounds so West Coast, I'm sure, and I was just fascinated with that material. And it happened to be that a friend had this, and she was like, I have that. And so I talked to her, and I said, I'd like to have some, and decided to make over 105 tiny chrysanthemums using porcelain at the studio of Maggie Boyd, who's a ceramic artist in Vancouver, and build these chrysanthemum talismans. But I threw in chlorite, and I'm not a potter, and I'm not a person that does ceramics. So it was a trial and error, but made it through. And I was able to create over 105 of these chrysanthemum talismans, which is a lucky charm that you carry. And it happens to be sort of in passing that we uncovered, or my mom uncovered, a box of these embroidery threads. So my grandmother was also what's called a bunkashushu, a hobbyist bunkashushu painter, which is an embroidery thread technique, which is basically pricking the canvas to make drawings. And she just had thousands of drawings of bunkashushu prints that she made. And these were the ends of strings that she used. So if you can see, she would cut up a piece of cardboard and write 152, and that was a specific green. And it was kind of like paint by numbers. And so I'd come across these strings, and I had decided, these talismans will be bound, just because I'm thinking about her and thinking about the work and the labor and her hands and the work that she did. And so I just spun the twine around each of these chrysanthemums. And as you'll know in my work, a lot of sort of uncanny things happen. So another funny, uncanny thing that happened was, this is an old image of my childhood house. And on Boys' Day, my dad would put up a koi nobody was just like these little fish for good luck. And I started to think about the childhood space and all the things he had planted for good luck. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a peach tree in the back. Actually, I'm just going to go back. This image probably is the better one. So that's me as the bald baby. My brother is doing the Charlie's Angels pose, and my mom, and in the back is the peach tree. And so while I was working on this project, my partner had removed the porch. We're renovating, moved the porch out, and then between the shack and where the tree used to be, between the shack and the house, all these like peach pits came tumbling out. And I thought, what an omen, what a sign. And so I called Makiko, who's the curator, said, I'm going to bring something weird to Japan. I'm going to bring peach pits. And she's like, hide them before, they'll get confiscated at the airport. Hide them. I was like, but she's like, but bring them. I think it's part of the installation. So I washed them all. And if you know, there's a Japanese myth called Momotaro, and it's this baby boy born out of a peach pit. And people say that the peach pit is sort of like this thing that you throw at demons. You can combat them, you can win. It's sort of like a lucky thing. So I thought, okay, I'm bringing these peach pits with me to Japan. And so I'll just go back here. So the chrysanthemums were hung upside down from the ceiling in the space upstairs. Keep in mind that in the lower space is this collection of underground women's history, stories and manga. And then in the other room, I also placed just a table and these peach pits that I washed and cleaned and put on mirror. And when we bounced a light, it just created this strange moon. So there's a moon and these chrysanthemums. And under the space, strange things happen. I won't talk about all this. We could talk about the strange things, but strange things would happen at the gallery. I'd get calls like, is there really magic dust in there? There's some strange things happening. But one really amazing thing that happened was, so Yoshito Ono, who is the renowned Buto dancer, I had asked, I'm going to be building this piece. When I was here in 2014, you taught me to dance with dolls, and I did end up making a tiny puppet of my grandmother. I wondered if you'd like to dance or move under this chrysanthemum garden. And he's like, of course. And I was like, really? Okay. And he's like, no rehearsals. And I was like, oh my God, no rehearsals. So there he went. No, he doesn't rehearse. He's Buto, right? So no rehearsals. Off we go. And he trained me with a Mexican artist made a puppet of his father. So he has a tiny puppet of his father, and I had a puppet of my grandmother. And we just moved through the space for 30 minutes or so, no rehearsal. So very intimidating. And so some magical moments happened there. The last work I'm going to talk about also will extend into some work that I'm working on now that opens in February. When I was in Japan in 2014 for the Koganecho residency, Mikiko also said, while you're here, there's this other really interesting project that I think you would be interested in. So she was doing a series of site-specific works, inviting a couple of Canadian artists over to Japan to think about the site of Yonago. Yonago Tottori is sort of facing the Japan Sea, and it's a city that I've gone to before because I was interested in the ghost stories and the folklore that came out of that region, particularly Mizuki Shigeru's work, Shoji Ueda's work, and a lot of artists that worked with this idea of the after-image of the post-war. So I was like, of course, I'd be super fascinated in coming to do a work there. And so she took me on a couple of site visits. And Yonago is basically an old castle town, so it has these canals. And the first thing that she said to me was, we should try this so you can get an idea of the site. And so we hopped on this boat. It maybe takes about 10 or 15 people. And this sweet man, this old man, it's called a sendo-san, so a man that tells stories on a boat, is sort of sitting there. And he has this like crackly old radio, and you go on this boat journey with him, and he points to everything that's disappearing. So he's like, there used to be a factory there, but it's gone. Over there used to be this restaurant's gone. Everyone never appreciates this lagoon. So it was a bit of a dark but true story adventure that I was on. And we came across this island called Kayashima. also called Fish Cake Island, because back in the day it looked like fish cake. I don't know if you have this here. It's fish cake on a wooden board. So it's Fish Cake Island. And he pointed to it in amidst all this talk about gentrification and the disappearing and said, you know, there was a woman here that made the best noodles, and she was really beautiful. And then he carried on again and went on. And I thought, okay, I'm interested in that little nugget of information. And so I held that in my head. And then the other thing that we were going through during these site visits was there's a lot of vacated spaces with these strange holes in the architecture. So what you're looking at is an old eyeglass shop, and they had this strange skylight. And so Mikiko was sort of introducing me to all these different places. Where do you want to make the work? Where do you want to place the work? And I didn't want to make I didn't want to place materiality into the space. So I asked, could I make a work that would accompany the man on the boat? So the work Paper is about it. I had to perform it in Japanese, so it was like, no English, you must perform this in Japanese. So it's a narrative that I wrote called Paper. You're looking right now at the English version of it, but in Japan, when I did Paper, it's a 23-minute story about this island and the cafe that's there, and this woman named Kay, and she's making noodles. And strangely, this hole rips open in her restaurant, and she's able to see through to the 1900s forest industry on the Gulf Islands. The other kind of key in this is that the curator was piecing together connections between that Japanese island and the islands of British Columbia. So there was a boom of migration in the 1900s. So it's a sort of fantastical story. It's connected here, but I feel like it won't work, so I'm not going to play it, but definitely you can check it out on my site. This is the story called Paper, and we performed it, or we played it. You listen to it on headsets, and you take the boat ride. And then the Sendo-san also, after my fictional narrative, he then goes into his story. So I made sure that he was able to keep his story intact. And then the piece this last January came to the Contemporary Art Gallery, where we used the False Creek area to perform this on little boats. And at the end of it, when you arrive at the end of the dock, the Contemporary Art Gallery has a small field house space, which are vacated spaces in Vancouver's Parks Board, in the parks. And you could have a Japanese-Canadian fisherman's meal after listening to the story. So that is what happened. What's interesting is after the residency was done, a woman, and I had thought this was a fiction, a woman came forward and said, I need to talk to the artist because I want to tell her that that restaurant is real. So it was weird. On the day of the opening, we got a phone call. The curator got a phone call, and the woman said, it's real. I'm the granddaughter of the woman that lived on the island. And so this summer, and I'll just quickly go through this, I was able to go back. I worked in a space, the old eyeglass shop, and renamed it the Third Eye, and invited anybody that remembered anything about that island to come forward to help me finish the series, which is called Rock, Paper, Scissors, which is a multimedia installation. It opens in February in Burnaby. I've decided it's housed back in the gallery, so it's not experiential. It's installation with some animation and some moving images. In the Third Eye, in one of the chapters of Scissors, I should note that Rock, Paper, Scissors also looks at the objects of wood, charcoal, and steel. So in the chapter of Scissors, there's a 30-foot giant that appears. And so there's a lot of children in Yonago, so the Third Eye was open for kids to come in and draw out and imagine the giant. And so I collected, thousands of images of giants, which you'll see in a moment. And along with some media crew, which I'm not sure why they came with us, but we were able to go back to the island. So here I am in my Indiana Jones hat. It was super hot and uncomfortable. And the curator and I got onto the island. And the only thing we could find was this weird staircase. So there were some, research adventures there. And the final work opens in February. So these are just some stills from it, but stop motion, some puppets, some large scale. That's the giant on the side, and a series of new audio works are part of it. But I think I'll end there. And if you have any questions, I know it went through that fast, but please let me know. Thank you. Yeah, so it was historically first created as a protest to the bombing of Hiroshima. So it's when they're painted all white and they're in the nude and they kind of look like ghosts. I don't think Sackville has a buto. That's true, right? No, Vancouver has a lot of them. So you're completely naked and you're in white, and you basically are like performing the dead or performing the kind of the ghostly. But in the school of Yoshito and Kazuo Ono, why I was fascinated with that school, there's several different schools of it. He did this really great piece about his mother. So Kazuo Ono would perform his mom, just holding a single flower. And not naked and not in white and just in a hat and a dress. And so it's sort of about the kind of transformation of body, and it's connected to kind of emptying out. There's no rules and you just kind of move. That's why he said no rehearsal. So I was like, but yeah. I think it's because I'm also like engaged with memory or engaged with things that are actually happening in the world. Like, so there's these chance things that are also coming into play. And so I think that's what creates the puzzle. Like I'll work with a group of, school kids that are not trained as performers, or I'll bring in situations where people aren't trained necessarily to know how to be in the space with you. So I think those are some puzzles. And I think they're like conundrums, I guess, but I enjoy them for the most part until I'm running to deadline and then I'm like, I cannot do this, which is what happened in the residency in Kokuracho. There was all these there was notions, I think I was hitting on notions, but I felt like I couldn't complete the work. There was just overload of monster stories, my aunt with the doll, the house that I couldn't get into, and there's just too much, right? Yeah. In Vancouver, it felt more like discussions around contemporary fear. Like my monster could be I can't pay my bills. My fear could be that I'm afraid that my child would grow up and be a monster, or that sort of thing. But in Japan, and I think maybe it's the lens of the fortunes, I think that draws a certain kind of public and a certain kind of audience. I had people that were like, something right out of a Haruki Murakami book or something, where a suited man would appear and be like, I am actually a fox shaman. I'm like, what? Or like, I ate a fox shaman when I walked by this grave. Or like, and these are true things. Like, these are things that just everyday things. And I remember in residency, there was one of the local artists has this shop of like illustrations and comics, and she was next door, and she came over, knock, knock, and she goes, this isn't new, fortune telling's not new. And I was like, oh no, I'm not saying it's new. And she's like, because where I'm from, and she's from more in the northern part of Japan, she's like, we always consult our psychics and shamans. This is not new. So I just think it was a freeness or an openness to tell these stories, and it wouldn't be judged as bizarre or weird, I think, was what was happening.